Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I am the Director of Educational Programs here with the National History Academy. And this lovely afternoon, we are continuing our virtual tour through different historic sites across the country. And we are fortunate enough today to be joined by Park Ranger Rich Condon from the Reconstruction Era National Historical Park. So Rich, thank you so much for being with us, and we'd love to hear more about this historic site.
Great, thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I do have a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to share with y'all once I get my share screen up here. We'll talk a little bit about what our park is, what the story is we talk about, and kind of the general themes that this story covers as well. So can everybody can see the screen right now? Okay, cool. All right, so let me start the slideshow. All right, so just kind of a little foundational talk here. What you're seeing right now, this is our visitor center in downtown Beaufort, South Carolina. You know, if you're kind of taking a vacation to the South Carolina Low Country, we're actually right across the water from Hilton Head Island. We're right between Charleston and Savannah. And we're actually spread out over two different islands. So when you think of a national park, generally, you think of kind of this, chunk of preserved land by the federal government. Well, it's kind of like that, but we don't have a whole lot of acreage. What we do have is a lot of stories to share at three different sites. And so that's kind of what I'm going to cover here today is those three different sites. Each of them is about 10 to 15 minutes apart by driving. If you were to come to Beaufort County and visit our main visitor center, this is what you would see. In fact, this is not a Reconstruction era building. It's post-Reconstruction. You can actually see a little sign there that says circa 1911. So it's built roughly a decade after Reconstruction ends in Beaufort County. This is an old firehouse that actually served many different purposes throughout the 20th century. But today, this is kind of where we open the door for visitors to talk about this Reconstruction story. And the way we talk about Reconstruction in Beaufort County covers fairly long timeline. If you talk to most historians about the era of Reconstruction, they'll usually start you in 1865. The reason being, of course, it's the end of the American Civil War. You have the passing of the 13th Amendment by the end of 1865, which abolishes slavery with the exception of punishment for a crime. And then we have the passing of the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship to those who are born here and naturalized. And then also the 15th Amendment, which is granting the right to vote and not barring people from voting based on race. And those are all known even today as the Reconstruction Amendments. That's a big part of the story here. But we go further than that. Most places you go to, they'll say Reconstruction ended in 1876, 1877. With the election of Rutherford B. Hayes to the office of President of the United States. With his election, he pulls United States troops out of southern states like South Carolina. And of course, a lot of white Southerners who, had enslaved people in the pre-war period or perhaps served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War are trying to restore this pre-war order, what they saw as a racial hierarchy. And of course, at that point, we're in the Jim Crow era, which would last for the next century into the 1960s. Well, in Beaufort County, it's a little bit different because about 85 to 90% of the population is African American. A lot of these people can trace their roots to those who were enslaved here on the South Carolina coast at one point in time. But they can also trace their roots to those who self-emancipated here, people who purchased property here for the first time in their lives, attended school here for the first time. So there's a lot of moving parts to the Reconstruction story. And as opposed to ending it in, say, 1876, 77 here, we go to almost 1900. So it really begins the earliest here and lasts the longest here in Beaufort County, South Carolina. And so through the different sites that we operate here in Beaufort County, we tell different aspects of that story. So, if you're to visit our visitor center, we do have an exhibit set up inside. Aside from our park rangers, we also have volunteer staff who are always open to answering any questions visitors may have. And to kind of give you an idea as to how spread out we are, you can see up in the left-hand corner here, the old Beaufort Firehouse, our main visitor center. Off to the south here, about 4 miles south of Beaufort, on the same island, Port Royal Island, is a site of Camp Saxton. We'll talk about that in a little
Hey, Rich,
bit.
I'm so sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. I don't know. We're still frozen on that first screen. I don't know if you meant to move on to another one.
Oh, hold on here. That's weird. Let me.
Sorry, minor technical.
Well, thanks for letting me know, though.
Yeah, no.
What about now?
We're seeing the visitor center
Firehouse
part, the sign.
Oh, that's weird. Let me.
There we go.
I might have to do it this way.
Now I see them. Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Now let me. Okay. Still good?
Looks good. Now I see the map. Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So as I was saying, up in the left-hand corner is the main visitor center. 4 miles south here is, you can see Camp Saxton, which was actually the first training ground and recruiting facility for African-American soldiers during the Civil War, but also the early years of Reconstruction. And as I mentioned, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then off to the right-hand side of the map, you see Brick Baptist Church and Dara Hall. Now that's part of the Penn Center National Historic Landmark District, which you see enlarged at the very bottom. This is the site of one of the first freedmen schools that was established in the Low Country for formerly enslaved African Americans. In fact, Brick Baptist Church served as the site of Penn School for most of the Civil War, and is actually still an active African American congregation today in 2022. Dara Hall, the other location highlighted there, is kind of like our visitor center out at Penn Center. In fact, we have an exhibit set up there. The building itself is about twice the size of our main visitor center in Beaufort. And it's actually the oldest standing building on Penn Center's property today. It's built about 1900. And so I have some photos of some of these places, and I'll give you kind of a rundown of the background of these sites as well. Now, can you still see this? Like the chain?
We see the map right now.
Oh man, all right. I'm gonna have to do this the hard way.
All right. Now we see it.
All right, you can see that fine?
Yes.
Okay, so we were talking about Brick Baptist Church and Dara Hall and Penn Center, or Penn School as it was originally known. This is Penn School. This is in fact the Penn School building that classes would be held in from 1865 all the way to the first decade of the 20th century. Before that, this school, as I mentioned, was running classes out of Brick Baptist Church, which I believe I have a slide, a photo of that here shortly. But classes were running out of this church throughout most of the war. All the people you see lined up here, this is the entire student body at that point in time of Penn School. All these people, just maybe 5 or 6 years before this photo was taken, were living in the bonds of slavery. It was illegal for these people to receive an education, to learn how to read and write, according to South Carolina law. And of course, in 1861, Reconstruction starts here because you have the United States military showing up to Beaufort County, South Carolina. In fact, in November 1861, the United States Navy and Army drive all the Confederate forces out of this area, off these sea islands, as well as all the white plantation owners and enslavers. With all of them gone and with military emancipation in place, it allows for Reconstruction to begin. So a big part of the Reconstruction story is education. Once they are able to learn how to read and to write, that's something that can never be taken away from them. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on education. Penn School itself, in particular, was started by two teachers from Philadelphia, Laura Town and Ellen Murray. In fact, you can see one of them standing on the front porch of the school, surrounded by some of her scholars. And there's another one off to the right-hand side in the crowd there. They were joined by a third teacher in late 1862 named Charlotte Fortin, who was actually the first African-American school teacher at Penn School. She was likewise from Philadelphia. But they're running classes from 1865 into the early 20th century out of this schoolhouse. The people who you see pictured here, the freed population, their children and grandchildren will end up going to the school as well. In fact, this building in particular was disassembled the first decade of the 20th century, but from there it actually grew into a 50-acre school campus. It was an operational school until 1948. So it was really the longest running freedmen's school in this area, although almost every plantation in the South Carolina Sea Islands, and there's about 200 of them in 1861, almost all of the schools, all the plantations have a school. So you have this kind of revolution of Reconstruction taking place right here in this pocket of what was seen as the Confederacy. And this is actually a close-up of some of those students. That school, Penn School, is located on St. Helena Island, and that's actually where this photo was taken, not very far from Penn School's campus. And I mentioned Dara Hall, the one building that we do manage on campus. You can see it here. This is how it will appear if you do visit our site today.
We're still on the third picture, Rich. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I keep forgetting that. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Perfect.
There we go. All right. I just have to remind myself. Okay, well, yeah, Dara Hall here. Okay, now you can see it. So Dara Hall, this building really, from its construction, was a community center for the people of St. Helena Island. Everything from weddings, funerals, temperance meetings, union meetings were all held here. In fact, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there's also a basketball court in Dara Hall. So for a very long time was the center of community activity on St. Helena Island. Now, there we go. I mentioned Brick Baptist Church. You can see that okay?
Yes.
Okay. This is actually, and I'll blow it up for you, a circa 1900 photo of Brick Baptist Church. And so this is where I mentioned, those first classes were held here. This is actually taken from the roadbed, what is now known as Martin Luther King Highway. What's really special about this site, where this revolution of Reconstruction took place during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, about 100 years later, becomes the site of meetings and conferences for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So Dr. Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson, for example, are walking these same grounds that freed people did 100 years beforehand. And they're arguing for the same things they were a century before, such as, equal citizenship. Let me back out here again. This is a modern view of the church today. So as I mentioned, it is still an active congregation. And I always like to say, this park would not function as it does without the amazing partnerships we have. So we actually do have a great relationship with the congregation at Brick Baptist Church. We actually have an easement on the grounds around it. So we kind of maintain the cemetery there as well as the exterior of the building. And they just operate as usual. And then this other site I wanted to talk about a bit. Whoops, nope, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Looks like a bunch of trees, and it is today. But this is actually, what makes this special is this is the site of Camp Saxton, or part of the site of Camp Saxton. As I mentioned earlier, the significance of this site is, the fact that some of the first African-American men were enlisted here in the United States Army as early as the fall of 1862. The first South Carolina Volunteer Infantry was the first regiment of African-American men that would pick up arms and service the United States. But not only that, also fighting for the emancipation of 4 million people in the American South, and a little further for their citizenship in the United States. Something the men who enlisted here in South Carolina have in common with, say, African-American men who enlisted in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts during the Civil War, is the fact that they're not considered citizens of the country they're fighting for. They hadn't been since the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Now that all changes after the war's over. When the federal government is taking into consideration who deserves citizenship in the United States, they turn to approximately 200,000 Black men who served in the Army and the Navy during the Civil War. These guys deserve citizenship. And so when they passed the 14th Amendment in 1868, this is one thing they're taking into great consideration. And that's when citizenship is extended to African Americans across the country. One thing that I wanted to highlight here in particular, and real quick, I mentioned some Northern African American regiments. This is an example of one. This photo is actually taken in May of 1864 in Beaufort on the old parade grounds. It's the 29th Connecticut Infantry. This is probably about 900 to 1,000 Black men standing in line here on dress parade. And this is what a full-strength African-American regiment would look like. What happened at Camp Saxton with the 1st South Carolina Infantry really opened the door for African-American enlistment nationwide. These guys were mustered into service officially in January of 1863, following the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, and I'll cover that here in a second. But after that, you have the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, for example, being recruited in March of 1863. If anyone's ever seen the movie Glory, that kind of highlights their story to a certain extent. And then, of course, in May of 1863, the federal government establishes the Bureau of United States Colored Troops, which opens up the doors for African-American enlistment on a much larger scale. Once the federal government and the military and the nation at large saw how African-American performed in the field, because to be honest, a lot of them had their reservations. Once they saw how successful they were and how devoted they were to their cause, they decide that it's a great idea to start enlisting African-American men. And of course, in the long run, they help turn the tide of the war and secure citizenship. They define citizenship. And so now I'll move on to this next slide here. Kind of the crowning moment of Camp Saxton's existence is January 1st, 1863. Now, I know a lot of us celebrate New Year's Day, of course, on January 1st every year. But today, even in Beaufort County, South Carolina, Emancipation Day is celebrated. This is an occasion on January 1st, 1863, where Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation will be read to an estimated 5,000 people, most of them formerly enslaved. The Emancipation Proclamation declares that enslaved people in states that are engaged in open rebellion, such as South Carolina, are now forever free. Of course, you have to have U.S. troops in the area to enforce this wartime measure, which luckily here in Beaufort County, that is the case. And so it's argued by many that this may be the first or one of the first public readings of the Emancipation Proclamation right here in Beaufort County, South Carolina at Camp Saxton. And so you can see right here, there's a crowd of African-American soldiers raising their hats in the air. You have on the stage, you have the 8th Maine Brass Band, you have some teachers, you have military officials, government officials. But the two guys I want to point out in particular are the ones holding the flags. Think about what this flag meant to them before this day, during this day, and after this day. Those flags they're holding right there, 10 years beforehand, it's the same one they're enslaved under. Now, in 1860, when South Carolina seceded from the United States, that same flag is ripped down from every public-facing space in the state. About a year later, in December of 1861, when U.S. troops arrived, that same flag goes up in every public-facing space again. But they're still kind of living in this gray area. They're being referred to as contraband by soldiers and the government. They're referred to as stolen property. But the flag takes on this whole new meaning on January 1st, 1863, when under this flag, they're declared free in the eyes of the law. And under that flag, they will go forth and liberate thousands more who are still living in bondage. And so Emancipation Day, 1863, I always argue is kind of the crowning moment of Camp Saxton's existence. This is when everything changes. And one more slide I want to share with you before I take questions here is this is actually this is actually a photo of course, some African American musicians. This is taken in Austin, Texas, around 1900. Now, I believe it was last year that we made Juneteenth an official federal holiday. Well, Juneteenth is essentially Emancipation Day. In fact, Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, is when some of the last African-American enslaved people are declared free in Galveston, Texas. For a long time, they would refer to as June 19th as Emancipation Day or Jubilee Day. And eventually it'll become known as Juneteenth. It's this holiday that's spread not only outside of the confines of the state of Texas, but all over the world. And so this photo is actually from a Juneteenth celebration in Austin, Texas. And I just want to share this with you because I think it really kind of drives home this point that, Reconstruction is a very relevant subject even to this day. It's something that I think has really become a part of a lot of Americans' vocabulary in recent years. And so, with that being said, I want to start taking questions if anybody has any for me. Let me back up here.
Thank you so much, Rich, for all of that. We're going to bring on our intern here now with National History Academy, Ben Kellerholz, and Ben is going to read some audience questions for you.
Hi there, Rich. Great presentation. I was just saying beforehand that Reconstruction, and for Black Americans especially, is something a lot of my college career has been focused on anyway. So that was a great presentation. Let's see here. Yeah, so I guess to sort of combine some thoughts into one question, how as a site do you have to deal with the uber politicization of history, and especially when talking about these histories? How as a site do you have to deal with visitors who come with their own notions about the Civil War and its aftermath and telling these untold stories?
Sure. So, of course, one of the main things we try to do in those situations in particular is, talking about the true story of Reconstruction. For a long time, this story, even in the 19th century, was heavily politicized as it's going on. A lot of the early books about Reconstruction, if you look at any of the ones that are written in the late 19th century, early 20th century, of course, have a very skewed view of Reconstruction. It's viewed as a failure by many. It's viewed as, Southern white politicians view it as an opportunity for African American politicians to move in on their territory. They try to smear their names as best as possible. One example I can give is Robert Smalls. And if you have never heard of him, you might hear of him soon because Amazon's actually working on a movie about him. Robert Smalls was a very prominent politician here in Beaufort County. He was born enslaved, self-emancipated himself and his family. Fast forward to the 1870s, he's serving 5 terms in the United States House of Representatives. He's creating public policy that's much more inclusionary of people of all races and all sexes. But of course, a lot of those former Confederates, former enslavers, are going to try to smear his name. In fact, Wade Hampton, who was elected governor of South Carolina in 1876, who kind of brings in, the end of Reconstruction in most of the state, he considers Robert Smalls to be, quote, an obstacle that needs to be taken care of. And so how do you do that best is by trying to rewrite history, basically erase African Americans like Robert Smalls from the history books. One thing you'll notice in a lot of these stories of prominent African American men from the Reconstruction era, after 1877, some of them just drop off the face of the earth. And it's because of that. It's because of those harmful books that are written, those harmful articles that are written, and them being perpetuated. So the best thing we can do is educate ourselves and educate others. And one of my favorite things to see is when doing a program, kind of those light bulbs, going off above people's heads when they connect the dots. And I just let them do that themselves.
That's awesome. And that's the great work of being in any kind of history, right? I think that's interesting. Robert Smalls has been someone a lot of people have been like, there should be a movie about that guy for years now, right? Let's see. We have, okay, so here's one or two combined rather. What was so vital about Beaufort County that it made it the site for this national historic site, and considering that Reconstruction was something that happened throughout the South?
Yeah, so because of, number one, it happening so early here, it lasting so long here, but also several components. You have African American land ownership is a big one. During the war, all of those white plantation owners and enslavers that left behind these 200 or so plantations abandoned their property. And so the United States Treasury Department, who's operating what they call the Port Royal experiment here, are going to give them notice. They say, if you don't pay back taxes in your property within 60 to 90 days, this is going up for auction. Now, as that's going on, you have formerly enslaved people who are still working on these plantations, but being paid for their work, money that they can finally save for the first time in their lives. And so, of course, most of those plantation owners don't come back, and they start to auction off this land. Now, these people who were once considered property by those plantation owners are now buying the property of their former enslavers. They are going to pay $1.25 per acre of land, and of course, they also have the opportunity to buy a lot of those big houses that were owned by the white planter class in towns like Beaufort. So yeah, land ownership is a big one because, of course, a lot of the people who bought property during Reconstruction, their descendants still have a lot of that property today. And of course, the education story. This is one of the first places that formerly enslaved African Americans are learning how to read and to write. Before the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, where they built freedmen's schools across the American South. So there's quite a few different factors that go into the reasoning why this exists here. On top of, the community wanted a national historical park established here, or a national monument originally, to talk about the Reconstruction era.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. We had, maybe I'll tie it into the next one, but someone else was bringing up the Freedmen's Bureau as well. And we can see also, as you mentioned, the SCLC, some almost 100 years later, how those things are always interconnected. Let's see. What was the, Beaufort County like during the so-called nadir period, or otherwise called the redemption period of the 1890s, when you sort of had white Southern Democrats getting back in power? Was there sort of a blowback to Black land ownership en masse at that time, or education at that time?
Yeah, so, kind of backing up a little bit, there's blowback even in the 1870s. One thing I like to kind of mention is, the fact that in 1873, 74, you had a big economic collapse. And so with that went the Freedmen's Bank. In fact, there's a Freedmen's Bank on Bay Street in downtown Beaufort. And, the people who had been working for their money and saving their money for the better part of a decade in 1873, 74, lost all their money. A lot of it was being mismanaged by folks in Washington. And this is before, their money's federally insured. And so with all that money gone, they can't keep up with the taxes on property they'd purchased during early Reconstruction. Perhaps they can't afford the seed or the feed or the animals to keep their farms going. And of course, that's kind of the economic side of the end of Reconstruction. But also you have, when Wade Hampton takes office, you have his kind of physical arm of the Southern Democratic Party, the red shirts that are committing acts of violence against African Americans. Now, you don't hear about racial violence quite so much on these sea islands, like St. Helena Island, for example, because even in the 1890s, it's 80% African American. Once you get on the mainland, it's a bit of a different story. In fact, in 1878, Robert Small, while most other African American office holders are being pushed out of office, Robert Smalls is still quite active, and he's campaigning in a town called Gillisonville, which is not very far from the islands. And 800 red shirts show up to his speaking engagement and start to harass African American voters. They make an attempt on Robert Small's life. So I guess kind of what I'm trying to get at is, in Beaufort County, like I said, we end Reconstruction in the 1890s because up until that point, African Americans are in Beaufort County in particular, still kind of, living as they did a decade, 15 years beforehand. But of course, the Jim Crow laws, especially in 1895, when the new Constitution is written for the state of South Carolina, most African Americans are disenfranchised. And so without the vote, you don't have a voice. Well, you don't have a voice in public policy.
Right. And yeah, so thanks. I suppose that's what the question gets at. That sort of happens in the span of the middle 1890s all over the South, right? Let's see. What kind of artifacts might you have at the site?
None. Since we're, well, you could consider the sites themselves artifacts. Dara Hall is an artifact, or Brick Baptist Church. We don't really, when you think of like a national battlefield park, for example, you think of archives with muskets and letters and things like that. We don't necessarily have that quite yet. We're a very new park, since we started as a national monument in 2017 and were redesignated a National Historical Park in 2019. There's still a lot of things that are coming together. In fact, I believe in our archival collection today, we have a painting that was made several years ago by a local artist depicting Emancipation Day at Camp Saxton. So that's our other artifact.
Nice. We just got a question here about how did you get redesignated, and what was that process, or what is the significance of that?
So Congress voted to make it a National Historical Park from a national monument, and basically what comes with that is increased funding. With increased funding, that means increased staff, so we can actually have park rangers on site sharing the story of Reconstruction. Of course, with that increased funding also comes other perks, such as the establishment of the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network. If anyone's ever heard of the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, it's very similar. But in this case, we, of course, are linking together Reconstruction-related sites. Now, there's quite a few national park sites that are related to Reconstruction, but there's a lot that aren't. And there's a lot of private sector museums and historic sites that relate to the Reconstruction era. And you can actually find, if you go to our website, it's nps.gov/REER, REER. You can find on there the Reconstruction Era National Historic Network, as well as information about our park alone.
Awesome. Well, I hope I'm not missing anything. Doesn't appear so. So with that, I'd like to ask you sort of our concluding question, which is, being such a great guide for us today, how did you get to this spot in your career? And perhaps maybe you have advice for young people or anyone that would want to do a similar kind of work.
Sure. Yeah. So it was a long, weird road to get here. And, I actually, when I first started going to school years ago, I of course loved history, but I didn't know that I would end up working in the field of history. My first public history job began in 2012, actually in Franklin, Tennessee, working on Franklin Battlefield for a 501c3 called the Battle of Franklin Trust. And for the next several years after that, I worked for private sector museums and historic sites. I didn't actually get involved with the National Park Service until 2017 as an intern and volunteer at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia. And that's really where it all began for the Park Service for me. Once I started doing that and seeing what the Park Service does, I got really excited about it and researched all the ways that I could get my foot in the door. One thing that I would always emphasize is you got to kind of put in the time to get what you really want. And by that I mean if you want to seek out an internship or just volunteering you can put on your resume. You're learning the story, you're learning how to interact with visitors. Those are all good things to document. And then after that, I just started applying for seasonal positions. There's a bunch of different random ways to get into the Park Service. You'll want to start on usajobs.gov. All the hiring is done through there. But seasonal jobs, if you're a young person and like to travel around, it's a good way to kind of see the country. And of course, if you're a student, there's always pathways positions. If you're in school and you get a pathways position, you're getting paid to do your job while you're in school. And that's actually what I'm currently doing. I'm almost done with it in 3 weeks here. So yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to go. And I just have to say, the big takeaway is be persistent.
That's awesome. And congratulations on almost being finished. That's great to hear.
Thank you.
And well, Rich, we are out of time. I apologize for any technical difficulties if that was on our end, but I think everything went really well, and we truly appreciate you taking the time and being with us today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you everyone home for tuning in. We'll be back here next week at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and we hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your day.